It is a fact that we do not have long-term evidence about how the body is affected with puberty blockers, with cross-sex hormones. Like, we are all quite literally medical experiments. We're like, hey, maybe if we just stop kids' puberty, they'll pass better, as if, our bodies are so simple, as if we're like Mr. Potato Head dolls and we can just switch parts. If you look at biology, we are like layer of complexity, stacked on layer of complexity, stacked on layer of complexity, stacked on layer of complexity. It is massive. Like, I have this book of the immune system, and it's like this thick, and it's just the immune system. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And so you cannot just halt the development of the body. Like, puberty is not, you can't just stop puberty. Because you cannot stop development, because you cannot stop cell division, because you cannot stop time.
Today I'm interviewing Airiel Salvatore. He's a detransitioner and speaker, and he is excited to break past self-imposed limitations and beliefs and commit to authenticity and curiosity and chasing the truth. Airiel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Of course. Well, we just had a panel discussion in New Mexico for Partners for Ethical Care, which is the sister organization of Transition Justice. And, you did a fantastic job. You're just so articulate and just really, well, you were a tearjerker. I'll say that. And it was a really fantastic group as well. Like, I just feel like all of you were so insightful. And so I'm really excited to be speaking with you today. So my first question is, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are as a person, and also your transition and detransition story?
Yeah, I would absolutely love to. I want to say thank you for describing me as articulate. I feel like for a long time, I've really kind of shut myself out of the possibility of even really feeling like I have anything important to say, because I had always just really framed myself as someone who didn't have much to share, someone who wasn't important. And that really, kept me from seeing the reality of my ability to communicate and my ability to connect with people. And I like that you described me speaking, and that I was a tearjerker, because I've always been an incredibly sensitive person, and I've always been. I feel like my emotions have always kind of been like right at the tip of my tongue, right easily within reach, but that also kind of comes a bit as a double-edged sword, because I've always been incredibly overwhelmed by my emotions. And they have this way of kind of sweeping me up. And I feel like when I finally started to develop the ability to self-regulate and to examine my emotions and to kind of gain a little bit of, I don't want to say control necessarily, because I feel like emotions really happen, but my ability to recognize when they happen and identify them, and then to be able to use them with some agency, I feel like it's really opened up this ability for me to speak and communicate in a really powerful way. Because when I went to this Partners for Ethical Care event, there was a day before and a day after where I got to spend time with the wonderful women who ran this event and were there to support. And I really had the chance to connect with them and also the other detransitioners, and to share stories and to really build these connections. And they really made it difficult for me to continue to believe what I, kept telling myself, that I have nothing to share, that there's, I don't know what I'm talking about, all of these automatic negative thoughts that really consumed most of my early life and hell, life up until kind of recently. And so I really feel like I have kind of opened the door to really understand myself better and to see what I have to share. And yeah, so I've always been incredibly emotional and sensitive.
Would you
And
describe yourself as a, sorry to interrupt, but what it came
please,
to mind is the concept of the highly sensitive person. I recently started reading that book. I don't know if you've read it, but does that sound like something that resonates with you?
yeah, so I haven't read that book, but that concept definitely resonates with me. And it's kind of been with me my whole life. And that kind of leads a bit into my transition story, which is when I was a kid, I was also incredibly sensitive. And I come from a pretty broken home. I was really raised by my mom and my grandma, mostly my grandma. And that's because when I was 3 years old, there was this crazy turbulent time where I had two uncles, and also my mom and my two uncles, all siblings from my grandma on my mom's side. And their father was incredibly abusive. He grew and sold drugs, and he was heavily in. He was from what I understand, kind of a big name in the community when it came to that stuff. And so they weren't allowed to have friends over when they were younger. And he was abusive in that he had huge anger issues. He would physically abuse and emotionally abuse all of like my grandma and his children. I heard stories of, if he was in a bad mood and one of the, like my mom or one of my uncles was chewing with their mouth open, he would just not say anything. He would stand up and walk over and literally just backhand them off the chair. My grandma had to defend herself with a gun once or twice. There was sexual abuse from other relatives in the family. And when I was about 3 years old, there was this period where not only did my father leave my mother for crazy reasons that I'll elaborate on in a minute, but also my oldest uncle, my mom's brother, was murdered. And he was either murdered by some direct connection with his father. There's some speculation on whether or not it was him or my grandpa got him in a scenario that got him murdered. And because of the way that there are often bigger fish to fry, I think there's a good chance that he probably gave up some names to protect himself, and it was ruled as a suicide. But the evidence just doesn't suggest that that was the case.
Wow.
And yeah, that essentially broke my family. And my mom, since that point on, dealt with a lot of mental health issues. I think she was dealing with bipolar, possible schizophrenia. I know she was on medications for some of that stuff. She had massive waves of depression most of her life. And my grandma, having come through a lot of that trauma, was really just focused on make ends meet, be able to feed my mom and me. But she was very, very emotionally unavailable, and she was the most loving. And my mom was incredibly emotionally unavailable because of a lot of her own mental health issues. And during this time, my father also left, and he had a lot of issues. He had issues with his own masculinity, what it meant to be a man, and how he projected that onto everyone else. And he had a massive drug problem. He was a meth addict. And he was the kind of person who he always had something to prove. And so he would always try to be the most dominant person in any situation. He would try to put you in your place. And I was told that when my mom was in the hospital in labor with me, my grandma was there and he was there. And he would like make a joke, or maybe he was serious. I'm not entirely sure. He'd be standing at the door and he's like, as soon as that kid's out, if anything's wrong with him, I'm out of here. He would say things like this. I was told when I was 3 months old that when he couldn't get me to stop crying, he would tell me to be a man. And right, like not even a 3-year-old would be able to recognize that, but like a 3-month-old, I don't know if that was his way of talking to himself and trying to cope. But, I know that when a child is out of the womb for the first few months, there's an incredibly important phase called, I think, the attachment and attunement phase, where there's a whole lot of eye contact, where like one of the parents makes a lot of eye contact and tries to emotionally stabilize and connect with the child. And a lot of these early phases of life really affect the trajectory that you're going to head. Kind of like where, to make a science reference, if you've ever heard of a chaotic pendulum, it's where you have a pendulum that swings and you have multiple pendulums connected on a joint. And very subtle conditions, very subtle differences in the starting conditions will compound into drastically different trajectories over time. And even though we have genetics at play that make us predisposed to certain things, there's also a lot of differences that can happen in the attachment attunement phase where, I believe a sense of like self-security can really be fostered or can turn into kind of a handicap, especially if you don't address it. And the longer it goes unaddressed, the more difficult it'll be. And so, and I think I was already just out of the womb, very sensitive. It seems to be like a predisposition I have. And I didn't have a lot of emotional security and support just growing up. And so the way that manifested in me was just being incredibly reactive to my emotions and my affect state. And I felt like at least when I was with my mom and my grandma, which is where I spent most of my early childhood, I didn't, at least they weren't so destabilizing. I wouldn't get yelled at and antagonized like my father would do. And so that was at least a plus from that side of the family. But my father, essentially, as far back as I can remember, I always hated visiting and being around him because it was nothing but negative memories. I was always riddled with anxiety being around him. I had trouble controlling how I felt. And when you don't have a deep sense of, security from within, you seek it from without. And that makes you susceptible to, bad actors and, wanting affirmation from people who don't deserve, your love and connection. And so I just remember being kind of desperate for my father's approval and always trying to change my behavior to calm him and to make him feel more secure so I could be more secure. And it never worked. And I didn't know at the time when I was a kid, and I didn't even know until about 1.5 years ago that my father was a meth addict. I thought there was just some days where he was okay and he was kind of nice and we would kind of get along. And then the next day, without me changing any behavior, all of a sudden, everything I did was wrong. Everything I did was bad. I couldn't get his approval. And I was just like, I don't know how to describe it. Just one of the coping mechanisms I developed to deal with him was that I would freeze. I didn't have anywhere to run, so I couldn't flight. I was way too emotionally unstable to fight in any meaningful way. I tried a little bit of fawn where I would, try and like, oh, Dad, like, you're so great. You're so, I love the way that you do this, like trying to appease him. And that never worked because it never consistently worked. The only thing that worked was freezing. I would freeze. Sometimes I felt like one of those fainting goats. And so I would freeze, and he didn't like that because then I wouldn't react. And one of the ways that he got validation was by snapping at people and making them react to the way he wanted. And so I would freeze and I would just internalize and I would just hide in my head and I would bury myself in my own imagination.
And it makes complete sense that you would internalize it at that age, because young children don't have the wherewithal to look at the bigger picture and be like, you know, the problem is with this person and not me. Like when it's a parent, especially, the child's going to think that they are the problem and that there's something they could do to control, you know, the parent's behavior. And so, you know, that pattern that's created to kind of judge yourself and be like, well, maybe I could have said this or done this. Like that creates a pattern as well that can create trauma in adulthood.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what happened. That actually set a kind of a precedent and a pattern for the most of my life moving forward, where I would blame myself for things that were outside of my control. I would blame myself for being treated badly by many relationships moving forward. And I would internalize that a lot. And so one of the ways where the gender dysphoria really began, I think it was a little bit of a slow ramp up with one particular time that was so emotionally traumatizing that it had finally crystallized into a kind of lifelong gender dysphoria. And because one of the ways he was upset because I was his son. I was a little boy who wasn't being man enough. I think what he wanted was to get me to snap at him. You know, sometimes a dad might want his son to be strong, and a terrible way that comes out is to provoke until they snap. And so he would antagonize me and provoke me, like say something, talk to me, speak to me, and he would like touch me and poke me and prod at me. And I would begin to internalize that as I'm not man enough. I'm not the boy that he wants. And he would be like, "Are you a girl? Are you a little girl?" And you know, thinking that might you know, work in the way that he wanted. And I'm sure at first, you know, I'd be like, no, I'm not, you know. And there was a particular instance where my mom was going through, maybe I was like 6 or 7, and my mom was going through one of the worst kind of mental health kind of sprints in her life, where I think she even tried to take her own life. And I found her in the bathroom with like pills and stuff. And I had no idea what was going on, of course. And so she was struggling because like my grandma's like you can't be doing this. Like you have a child, you know. And my grandma, you know, like it was like a, you know, like a family history of people talk about kind of intergenerational trauma. And I'm not exactly sure how that works, but I do know that we learn about what healthy relationships looks like from our parents and our environment, because we are the kind of social species where we do the primary way that we learn is from the people around us. And so my grandma doesn't have any idea of what a healthy, emotionally mature relationship looks like. My mom has no idea. I have no idea. And my mom probably feels incredibly rejected by her own mom and just feels overwhelmed. And she's like, I'm going to go stay with this person that I'm seeing for a few months. And she should have left me with my grandma, but I'm not sure exactly why. Perhaps it was to push back at my grandma or something. But she sent me to live with my dad for 3 months. And when my dad left, right, he initially was still in the same hometown. And then he eventually moved to Idaho, out of state. And then I would go and visit him maybe once a summer. And this particular time, and it was never more than like a week. And sometimes just the weekend, because, you know, after a few days, I'd be like, I want to go home. I can't be here. It's just like it, you know, I'm just emotionally on edge and freezing the whole time. And I'm just terrified of this man. And I'm like, I want to come home. I want to come home. And this particular time, she sent me to live with him for 3 months. And it was just devastating for me. Like I just cried every single day leading up to this, saying, I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And, very quickly, as I anticipated, this particular vacation, if you want to call it that, went downhill, and all the normal stuff where it was just a hell of a time for me came back. And there are a few vivid stories that happened that I remember. I remember that we drove up this particular time and we got a puppy, and I loved this puppy because it was the only thing that I could attach to that wouldn't make me feel terrible. And and one of the ways that he would antagonize me on this trip is when I was misbehaving or not doing what I wanted. He would say, do you want me, he's like, do you want me to, we'll take this dog out into a field and I'll make you shoot it.
Oh my gosh.
And he had a person he was dating at the time that he eventually married. And she also, I could tell that I was a constant reminder that my dad was with another woman before me, before her. And there's that saying, being treated like a redheaded stepchild. And that always resonated because I always felt like she hated my guts. She treated me almost worse than he did sometimes. And they were both meth addicts. And so it was just like, the abuse was just so bad.
Would your mom send you to live there for 3 months? Was she aware of the abuse?
I'm pretty sure, because a little bit to kind of give a little bit of context. After I stopped visiting my dad, I was so dead set on putting him in my past that I really just buried those memories in a way. I not necessarily like buried the memories, but I just buried all of those experiences in a place where I'm like, I don't need to revisit those. I'm done. And so I never asked a lot of questions. And a year and a half ago, when I came out of my transition, when I finally realized that my childhood had really affected me, I asked her, I'm like, I need to know about this guy. Like, what happened? And then she told me that he was a meth addict. And so many pieces just clicked for me. And so she knew he was a meth addict. She must have known that it was continuing to be a problem when she would send me to visit him. So yeah, I mean, she must have known that he was on meth, and his girlfriend as well. So.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it was a hell of a trip. And this is when I went back to actually remember what happened and to comb through and be like, what can I learn from these experiences now that I have this new information? And there was a particular experience where, throughout my life, because I took cross-sex hormones for 18 years and I identified as trans for about 20 years.
Wow.
And people would ask me, when did you first know that you were trans? And I would tell them this story. When I was 7 years old, I went to go visit my father, and he was really abusive. And he would antagonize me and provoke me. And he would tell me, like, are you a little girl? Do you wish you were a little girl? And eventually one time I just snapped at him and I said, yes, I wish I was a girl. As a kind of rebellion in a way. And I didn't know right at the time that I was internalizing it, being like, I had seen my experience it's like I had locked in my experience from one particular angle as a coping mechanism to be like, yes, I am, because f you.
Mm.
And I would present that as the time when I first knew, while the rest of it, and like, I always thought it was some kind of like profound statement without really realizing that when people heard that, they were probably just horrified. And when I went back to actually re-examine those experiences from different angles, I had realized that leading up to that moment, like almost every day when he would provoke me, I would just internalize, I wish I was a girl. I wish I was a girl. If I was a girl, he wouldn't treat me like this. If I was a girl, I wouldn't feel like this. I could actually just be free to be myself. I wish I was a girl. Until one time he just provoked me enough for me to snap and say it. And that moment of me admitting it out loud, of me, basically, that was when the framing of, if I was a girl, my life would be easier, had finally crystallized and had became this life raft that I had latched onto, and then I began to build the rest of my identity for many, many years to come off of.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And when you said that you had told this story to people, when you would describe how you knew you were trans, I'm skipping ahead a little bit here. Oh, my kitty's making an appearance now too. This is Pepper.
Pepper, cute. Oh, she's so sweet.
Little cameo. Yeah, so I was just curious, like when you sought out, hormone therapy or surgery, things like that, like were you asked to share how long when you knew you were trans, and like, was this a story that you were sharing with like medical providers?
Yeah, so this is a good question.
Or mental health providers? Either or.
Yeah, so when I first saw a psychiatrist, I think it was like 2004 or so. And from then until maybe like a year and a half, 2 years ago, over this whole time, I had seen maybe 4 psychiatrists. I had seen like 5 or so doctors and like 6 therapists. And none of them really helped me dig into my father and what happened, the traumatic events, and, where my gender dysphoria started. Because it's pretty clear that the way I describe what happened is this was a coping mechanism that a traumatized child latched onto as a particular framing and identity. And kids do this all the time without necessarily it being revolved around gender. And it's a mental health professional's job to help them understand how their own past kind of affected how they're approaching life now, right? How these tiny decisions or framings that we used earlier and how we build off of them. And so no one helped me. Like, essentially, it's almost like when something is so core to your identity, it doesn't get examined because you just accept it as like a reality, right? The same way that no one hundreds of years ago or more really knew what gravity was or what water was or what the stars were. They just knew based off of their own experience, it just being so a part of life that no one really had the mental frameworks and the schemas to understand what was happening. And so I really just accepted these things as fact and hid them in a way, almost like if you take you think of like a video game, you have the camera, whether it's first person or third person. It's like hiding these things behind the camera, but relative to the camera, such that wherever you look, it's always behind the camera, because because you use this one particular tool only to examine these things. And
Right.
mental health professionals are supposed to help you pry the lenses that you use to view the world off of your face to see if the lenses themselves are distorted or not. Nobody did that. No one seemed to, like, I don't know if they wanted to. I don't know if they tried to, but I know as sure as hell they didn't succeed. And so I was always very honest about the answer, the things I would answer. I was never really trying to hide anything to,
Mhm.
like, because I know that, like, nowadays with a lot of the social pressure around trans identity, people are being coached into how to lie to professionals to kind of get what they want. And there wasn't really any of that when I started. I think that,
Yeah.
like, pediatric gender transition really first started in the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. And for me,
Mhm.
this process started in like 2004, 2005. And so, like, I was very early on. And so, and I was just being very honest about all of my experiences. And so I'm almost certain that, I told what I remembered, but I didn't remember about the drugs. And, I wasn't necessarily eager to talk about my dad, but I would explore if they asked me to, but they didn't help me understand it.
Yeah. It's it's all very strange. And you were transitioning in California,
Mhm.
correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that because I also transitioned in California and first sought gender affirming care when I was a teenager. And I do feel like they were kind of ahead of the game in terms of the pushing the affirmation and, not really exploring comorbidities or trauma, things like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is just, I wonder how it got so far that it went from, like, okay, you have this condition or you think you have this condition. Let's explore all of the angles and look at comorbidities and things like that. Going from that to like, okay, it's just there. There's nothing we can do to like alleviate this gender dysphoria other than changing your body. So just go ahead. Um, it's, if we think about any other mental health condition like eating disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, you know, um, it's never the approach is never just like, okay, well that's its own thing. Like there's nothing we can really do about that, or body dysmorphia, like
Yeah.
they're not like immediately just being like, oh, you hate your nose. Well, here's a prescription to go get a nose job. Like, it's seen as a disorder, or it's seen that it's at least causing the person distress. And so anyway, yeah, just I wonder when, because I have heard of people being gate kept, especially back then in other places. And as a detransitioner, I felt like whenever I shared my story, people would push back and be like, "Oh no, it's really hard to get on hormones. It's really hard to get approved for surgery and stuff." But there has definitely been this push for, less gatekeeping, more like, I mean, some of it seems to be just part of like the what they call the social justice movement, where it's like, oh, you don't question who a trans person is if they tell you who they are. Like you're not supposed to question it. Like that's transphobic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
do you feel like that kind of could have played a role in the way you were treated by your medical providers?
Yeah. I have seen, right, since like the very first time in 2004 or 5 when I saw this psychiatrist, I felt the initial gatekeeping, right? It was like 6 to 8 sessions for them to try to evaluate if this was a good road for me to go down. And I was eventually approved, right? Because I was at what, like 13, when coming into like puberty and starting to, all of these, understanding yourself as a social creature and your social status relative to your peers, right? All of us struggle during those times. And I struggled with school because my mom was inattentive for, how I did in school. And so depression came on really strong at 13. And right. And it's funny because from that one trip up to 13, I had kind of readjusted to being a little boy, and those feelings kind of faded. Once depression came back in, all those feelings came back. All of like the disconnecting and disassociating came back. And when I saw this psychiatrist, I felt the initial gatekeeping, right? Because this is a difficult path. It's not some quick fix. It felt very much like you only go down this road if you must.
Mm.
And so it was difficult for me to initially get hormones, and I started them at like 15, late 15, maybe early 16. And I was a late bloomer for puberty. So I definitely not finished puberty before starting all of this stuff, which basically kind of halted it.
That's really young to start, especially, back then there were a lot fewer teenagers transitioning.
Yeah. And so that was my frame of reference for initial gatekeeping. And I'm going to fast forward a little bit here where at 19 years old, so we're like 2008, and I moved out of my hometown and stayed with someone I was dating, and the relationship didn't work out. Not having a good idea of what healthy relationship looked like. I was a pretty bad partner, and I was left with a choice: go home or try to figure it out. And I was basically willing to be homeless to figure it out, so I wouldn't go back to my hometown and wither, because rigid framings is how you deal with life when you have struggled through things and don't have the tools. And I stayed in a youth homeless shelter in West Hollywood. The LGBT center there had some bunk beds for people in a tough spot. Then there was also the Covenant House, which is like a religiously sponsored homeless youth shelter. And homeless youth shelter in this program is from 18 to 24. And this is when I met other trans people for like the first time. Up until that point, I was everyone's first contact with what it meant to, be a transsexual, or we called it transgender then. We weren't under any delusion that there were more than two sexes. We knew that we wanted to live and pass as the opposite sex.
Mm-hmm.
Even if, we also believe that maybe we were born in the wrong body. And, so there, after just a few therapy sessions, not even psychiatrist sessions, I think it was like two to three therapy sessions, one quick psychiatrist session approved for hormones. I went through the same process in San Francisco, because after about a year in West Hollywood, I left, went to San Francisco. At least it was a little bit closer to my grandma, so if anything went terribly wrong, she can come pick me up. I stayed in the youth homeless shelter there. There's many other trans-identified people there. And by trans-identified, I mean people seeking transition. That's what trans meant, right? And so about 15% of the people in these shelters were getting cross-sex hormones. And at this point, I don't even remember, and this was like 2010, I don't even remember needing any therapy to get approved for hormones. And so the gatekeeping came down really quickly between 2008 and like 2012, depending on the location, I believe. And yeah, it's interesting, right? Because when it comes to other psychological disorders, right? When someone has anorexia, we don't affirm anorexia. We, like you were saying about when someone has body dysmorphia issues, we don't prescribe them plastic surgery. This was really the only thing where we tried to change the body to match the mind, and it is a mental disorder, like it is a mental illness, because a lot of us were seeking relief. I was like, I'm not excited to be trans. I wish I was embodied as female so I wouldn't be fucking miserable. That's what I would tell people, And there's definitely a social contagion aspect to this, because I used to bounce from friend group to friend group because I didn't know what it meant to, build emotionally healthy connections with people. I didn't know what it meant to be responsible and to stick around and to patch relationships when you've done something wrong and to take ownership. And so I went from friend group to friend group when things got bad. And, it's kind of easier to be around some people that are LGBT, which is something that is innate and that you're born as. And they would be like, "Oh, what is transgender? I never heard of this before." And I would explain, like, I'm born in the wrong body, because that's what I believed. And very quickly, someone else would take their internal struggles, take this new framing that I showed them, and be like, "I think I'm trans."
Yeah.
And yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Did you
I
want
was
to
going
say
to say
something
that,
else?
like, now we're in a climate where people are like, trying to suggest to people that this is the case. But at the time, I'm just like, probably not. This is a hell of a road. You do not want to go down this road if you do not have to, like, unless you really are, because it's just miserable. And so I remember trying to push people away from this path, because it's when you really are convinced of these things, you can't change your body. It's really just this relay race of denying objective reality and denying biology, and you're opting for one of the most extreme forms of body modification to ease your own suffering, because you don't have the tools to realize that there's actually a back door. All you have to do is change your framing and to see the tools that you're using to heal some of this stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a sense of responsibility with expressing that it is a difficult path and kind of tempering their expectations versus today. There's so many people making it seem like it's really easy and it's no big deal. And, like even these words that we use for, like top surgery, bottom surgery, like it's just some kind of routine thing, or, a hormone replacement therapy. Like it's not hormone replacement therapy. It's introducing artificial hormones that
Yeah.
upset your natural balance. So, yeah, I feel like today it's gone a lot more to like people are actively encouraging other people to transition and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think maybe your character, or because you transitioned earlier, yeah, I feel like at least you had more of a grounded sense of reality in that, like, you knew that you weren't actually changing sex, and yeah, you weren't just going around like advertising it, like 5 signs that you might be trans, like you find all over social media today. Throughout your transition, I don't know if there was maybe an evolution in this from when you first started identifying as trans compared to right before you detransition, but how would you explain gender ideology, or I sometimes call it gender identity theory, like, this set of beliefs about gender, when you said the back door to kind of relieving your suffering from this is to reframe, like how would you describe that frame?
Yeah. So I didn't really realize that like, I guess, like, the reality is we have sexed bodies. Like, human beings are a sexually dimorphic species. There are evolutionary, and I think, there are reasons why there are two sexes as a reproductive strategy, right? We have small gametes or large gametes as a strategy, and those have downstream consequences to how our bodies differ on average between men and women. Even evolutionary psychology plays a huge role in trying to explain everything from like toy preferences to how women bond with each other versus how men bond with each other. And so there's an objective biological reality, and we have an infinite kind of personalities that we can have. And on average, we tend to, we have these, like, personalities and preferences tend to be, I guess, like a bimodal distribution in a sense, where you can have outliers, but a lot of women and a lot of men tend to hover around what makes sense for their sex. I feel like gender is essentially been a kind, almost like a social construct where societies have built upon these average differences between men and women that are actually there, and have built more on top of that to try to explain or to try to get people to behave a certain way, perhaps for like evolutionary survival reasons. Like a lot of culture is culture and ideas go through the same evolutionary process of like Darwinian selection to develop certain norms for survivability reasons. Like I think that spicy food is in hotter climates is developed because they have more foodborne pathogens, because it's warmer and it's easier for pathogens to survive. And spicy foods have I forget exactly what's in them, but it can kill some of these bacteria and make it harder for them to survive. And so essentially gender is really this set of like, I don't know, rigid, like it can vary in rigidosity, if that's a word. And we talk about these old school gendered stereotypes, like 1950s, like women in the dress who are stay-at-home moms and they cook all the food, and the men are the breadwinners. They provide the food and protection. And that's an example of evolutionary differences with a lot of cultural baggage piled on top of that.
Yes.
And for decades after that, we fought to eliminate these rigid stereotypes because there are always outliers who do not fit in these boxes, and they shouldn't be made to fit in these boxes. And so, we like gender identity ideology is essentially, it's like trying to fight rigid gendered stereotypes, but with more rigid gendered stereotypes. Instead of being like, there's no wrong way to be a boy or a girl, just be you, and don't let anyone tell you you can't do something, like that you're behaving the wrong way, like you're not a boy, you're not a girl, like the way that my father treated me. I wasn't man enough, even though I was a child, right? Instead of me being like, I can be a boy and I could be sensitive and I don't have to be fucking rough like the way you want me to be. I could do it my way. Instead of that, I was just like, I'm going to jump in this box that is labeled as girl and feminine, because that feels a little closer to where I'm at. But by jumping into that box, I have accidentally eliminated other possibilities as well. And so it's really just this like rigid way of thinking that is really limiting of the self. It's almost like the nose, you cut off the nose to spite the face, or something like that, throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's really just a regression back to gendered stereotypes to give the middle finger to the norm, in a sense, or at least what people perceive as the norm, because nowadays our environment is so much more understanding than it used to be, that we do have these freedoms now. And so the kind of oppression people are talking about no longer exists. And people are projecting old oppression onto the present to justify using these rigid stereotypes as a, it's basically like an ideological snake oil salesman being like, this framing will solve your entire life's problems.
Yeah. And it's so paradoxical today because, people who support generally transgenderism and gender ideology and like I guess trans allies, you would call them, tend to be like very, like they talk about like, oh yeah, we're breaking down gender stereotypes, like you can dress however you want if you're a woman, you can be masculine, and like it's fine to be like any kind of man you want to be. Like they'll say that, but then at the same time it's like, well, the first sign that this person knew they were trans is because they didn't like dresses, or because they like to play with Barbies instead of trucks. And it's like, it's so paradoxical, and because it's obvious to see that that it's based on stereotypes to a large extent, but somehow it's being passed off as like, no, this is breaking down stereotypes. And like, one of the arguments that's kind of thrown at me a lot, like if I speak out against, you know, not just medicalization, but, you know, personally, I think that it's the idea of being born in a wrong body is a harmful like idea. It doesn't mean that I dislike or, you know, wish harm on anybody who feels like they are, because I felt like I was at one point, you know. But people will push back and be like, oh, you want to go back to the 1950s, like you're a bioessentialist, like, you know, they don't get that it's actually that ideology that is going back to those stereotypes and not the other way around. So it's hard for me to see how that doesn't click. But then I remember, like, when I was in it, like, I believed that as well. So it's like you said, it's like having something in the back of your head that you're not aware is there, because you
perfectly out of view always.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's why a lot of these ideas, that's why, you know, in a lot of these circles, a lot of different kinds of ideology, everything from gender ideology to like woke ideology, these ideas don't get reality tested, because once you start to examine them with critical thinking, they fall apart very quickly. And so these ideas only thrive in an environment that artificially keeps them alive through like manipulation, social coercion, you know, and using like judgment, shame, and guilt, so people don't think the wrong way. It has to exist in a kind of like, ultimately there's like this umbrella of like a collectivist ideology that allows these ideas to thrive, you know. And you know, some of these are, you know, there's like a lot of these parasitic ideologies like postmodernism and stuff are kind of like the core building block that allow a lot of these things to survive. Like when you go to your build an ideology workshop, you start with your postmodernist foundation in order to build whatever the hell you want on top of it. Because when you can deny objective facts and truth, deny objective reality, then that allows you to sustain a kind of cognitive dissonance that will allow these ideas to thrive. And, you know, the social pressure in these groups do not encourage self-reflection and even asking questions a lot of the time. It's really just surviving through emotional reasoning and fear of ostracization. And they thrive in an environment devoid of any kind of gratitude. Like the fight or flight, I think like it's like they thrive in a state of amygdala hijack, the part of your brain that kicks you into fight or flight, because when fight or flight is happening, you need to survive, and you don't have the luxury of using your prefrontal cortex, which is incredibly cognitively expensive. And that's why, and like when your prefrontal cortex lights up, you experience gratitude, and you have better mood regulation, and you're able to really explore ideas in a psychologically safe way. And these two things are mutually exclusive. And essentially, that's why a lot of these ideas are also accompanied by a sense of the world is falling apart, we are being oppressed, and we are in a fight for survival. Like, I don't know if you've probably heard people be like, people are denying our existence.
Yes.
They don't think that we exist. There is a trans genocide. As if we are being lined up to the guillotine. You know, this kind of, there is a war for our existence is part of what is fueling this. And without a sense of gratitude, you can't, you know what I mean? Like they keep you from seeing the bigger picture. When I say they, I don't necessarily mean that these people are doing this on purpose. It's really like these ideas have hijacked people, these parasitic ideas, and are using them as hosts to survive. So like for these terrible ideas to exist. And so people are accidentally doing this to each other, thinking that they're helping each other. And when you don't have a true sense of perspective, I'm talking about like a societal perspective or a perspective throughout history, you cannot realistically attain important affect states like gratitude that allow you to really break free and to think individually.
Right. And the countries, it's not a coincidence that the countries where this ideology is proliferating the most are, by and large, first world countries where, you know, we have a lot more of the basics taken care of than, you know, other countries who might not have access to clean water, might not have access to medical
Right.
care, things like that, might not have access to the internet as much. And so the gratitude is like, yeah, that's an extremely important piece of it, because if you're so laser focused on gender and like, oh, I wish my body was different, I wish, you know, this and that, it's like we let go of like how many things we do have right going for us. And so
Yeah.
the gratitude in the bigger picture is so important.
It's a huge distortion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I like that you pointed out that this is happening in first world countries, and in particular the West and places
Yeah.
with Western values. And so even just if you expand outside of the gender bubble, you have things like critical race theory, and you have essentially this big umbrella of these ideologies that are essentially waging war on the West, on Western values and things like the Enlightenment and even science itself. And this is because, you know, when you don't have, like, the West has essentially created this massive amount of abundance. It's essentially created this, there's so much abundance that it's created this petri dish for ideas to mutate and to spread and to change and to adopt other ideas. And it's only able to sustain like these ideas that do not make sense and do not comport with reality because of all this extra abundance.
Mm.
And it's really sad that it's almost like a cancer, right? Because what a cancer does is it's a short game that has no vision for the future. It just will reproduce until it kills its host. And it doesn't just happen in biology, it also happens with ideas. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of this stuff. It's literally attacking the very thing that's allowing it to survive.
Yeah.
And we, you know, like it's like, I feel like it's just collectivism almost kind of in general. And, you know, we've seen this happen with like Mao's Cultural Revolution, where like it's essentially, I feel like it's, because like, I mean, we have two different modes of operation. We have an individual, and then we come together as a group to survive. And throughout history, we've essentially been warring tribes over resources. And we need the ability to be individuals within a group, to have conversations and to explore, because culture adapts faster to changing environments than genes do. But we also need to be able to come together as a group and act as one to survive. Otherwise, we're going to get wiped out by another tribe. And these collectivist ideas essentially keep us in this collectivist state and do things that are at the expense of the individual. And the Western values are essentially all about protecting the rights of the individual, because history has shown that the default state is tyranny. The default state are the power games where the powerful take whatever they want and the weak just have to deal with it.
Right.
You know, and it's like for these collectivist ideas to really thrive, they want to wage war on the protection of the individual and all of the things that sustain that, without having any real vision of the future of what happens after the revolution.
Yeah. And that, I mean, that makes me think of like how the communism is tied into all this, like so many, or communism, because like, it never, like in theory, communism is good, right? But then we've seen how it actually plays out in real life. And it's so many of these trans activists will have like the communist flag on the other side. And yeah, like when you said long-term vision, I feel like that's really missing, both from deciding to do something like take hormones, or like deciding to go the medical route. I feel like these people are, and and not necessarily that this is like purely their fault, because I think this is how the medical providers are representing it as well. But they're always like, well, I need to stop myself from harming myself in the moment, in the moment, this is life-saving. But we're not focused on like what happens to these people when they get older.
Exactly.
And same thing with the kind of the political ideology. Like it's always, take down the government, communism, things like that. But then, yeah, like what is really the long-term plan with this? Like it's all about destroy, and not about actually how do we build something sustainable.
It's really just like a rejection of human nature, right? I think one of the best quotes I've heard about communism, and I forget who said it, so I apologize here, but like, what do you think about communism? Well, great idea, wrong species, right? Communism works with ants and bees because they are quite literally a communistic species. They have one reproductive queen, and the workers, I believe, are sterile, and they work to serve the community. And if you try to map that onto human nature, it does not work, because first and foremost, we are individuals who secondarily have the ability to work together as a group, right? And when you put the collective before the individual, you then very easily take a step down a very short, very slippery slope of, well, to protect the collective, we can do these absolutely horrible things to individuals. And you see this through like Mao's Cultural Revolution, how they just absolutely humiliated, berated, and beat people publicly for having the wrong ideas. And we're seeing a kind of march in that direction at the moment, where we have these public humiliations of people who have the wrong ideas. We're willing to like metaphorically burn people at the stake. And it's horrible.
Yeah, it really is. And I wanted to go back to something you said a while ago now, which was about the prefrontal cortex. You brought that up, and what that made me think of is, the prefrontal cortex not being developed until age 25, and the fact that we are starting kids on these puberty blockers and other medical interventions earlier and earlier, like in the name of transition. And how do you, okay, two questions. How do you think that affects their ability to kind of reason and think logically, and grow up and become an adult? And the second question is, how do you think that parents, or even just us as a society, how can we protect our kids from this?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I'll start with saying, like, kids do not know who they are. I think it takes until like 6 or 7 before we even understand sex permanence. Like, I believe it, well, like probably like 4 or 5. If you show a kid like a doll with a dress, it's like, is that a boy or a girl? They'll say it's a girl. And if you take like a boy doll in the same dress, they're like, it's a girl. And if you like change their clothes, they'll be like, oh, it's a boy.
Mm-hmm.
And then at like 6 or 7, they start to understand more permanence of biology, right? And our prefrontal cortexes are developing, and like you said, until they're 25. And so our executive function to be able to make long-term decisions and having a better grasp of ourself and our place in society and in reality, and being able to make these important decisions are still coming online for a long time. There's no way that kids know who they are. I mean, adults a lot of the time don't even know who they are, right? Essentially, mistaking one particular framing for this is who I am for the rest of my life is a terrible idea. And so, you know, and even at 25, that's where I opted for bottom surgery. And I was locked into a specific framing. I still dealt with a massive amount of disassociation, and I could not regulate my mood, and I made a terrible decision, and I wouldn't have come to realize it until still many years after that.
Right.
And so, and it is a fact that we do not have long-term evidence about how the body is affected with puberty blockers, with cross-sex hormones. Like, we are all quite literally medical experiments, because it started as like a niche experiment in the Netherlands called the Dutch protocol, where you had adults who had transitioned and were unhappy with their own transition because of secondary sex characteristics of their natal sex, right? So they couldn't pass very well. We're like, hey, maybe if we just stop kids' puberty, they'll pass better, as if, our bodies are so simple, as if we're like Mr. Potato Head dolls and we can just switch parts. If you look at biology, we are like layer of complexity, stacked on layer of complexity, stacked on layer of complexity, stacked on layer of complexity. It is massive. Like, I have this book of the immune system, and it's like this thick, and it's just the immune system. Like, you know what I mean? And so you cannot just halt the development of the body. Like, puberty is not, you can't just stop puberty. Because you cannot stop development, because you cannot stop cell division, because you cannot stop time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's so unbelievable. It's so unbelievable that doctors even considered doing this to people in the first place. Like, I understand the trans activist thing, and being an older trans person and be like, what if I had been able to transition before puberty? But it's so crazy to me that that doctors would override like the other knowledge they have about the human body and the endocrine system and the immune system. And like, I have a degree in molecular biology, and when I took like biochemistry classes, I was really struck by like how much we do know, but also how much we don't know. And just all of the harrowing effects that just having a little bit too much of a drug in the body, and how that can, affect other receptors that you don't know what other receptors it's gonna bind to. Like, levels are very important, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And like, the fact that any doctor that had far more education than I do would be like, oh yeah, we're gonna try this on children, and just thinking that it even could be safe or would have enough benefit to justify the enormous risks. It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. I think there are two kind of parts that I want to add to this, right? It's that we don't, like, let alone do we not really know what happens to the body when we stop puberty, and that part of the body begins to continue, because like basically the body is kind of like, it's like a symphony where everything's firing in unison that adds up to this whole that is a functioning human, right? I mean, in addition to that, there's also just the brain that's basically doing the same thing. It's kind of just this hierarchy of symphonies in a way. And when you we stop puberty, but the body continues to grow, and there are parts of the body that are supposed to grow together to add up to this whole human. And when you stop part of it and the rest of it continues to grow, it can start, I'm sure it begins to distort the development, because there's supposed to be these things happening at once, when only one's happening at once, right? We don't know what the end result of that will be. And we don't know the development on the human brain. Like, perhaps one of the reasons that that I still have such a hard time regulating my emotion, that I still have, that it took me so long to develop the cognitive faculties to be able to, like, and the executive function control to look back and on what happened, to make sense of it and to start making better decisions now. This whole process could have been just stunted and delayed for like a decade because of, halting and messing with the endocrine system and my hormone system. You know what I mean? And we don't know what part that played. It could have played a major part. It could have played a little. We just do not have the evidence.
Right.
Yeah. And I find it crazy that, like you were saying, these doctors, they know the complexity of the human body. But when it comes to this issue, it's like all of that goes out the window. And this has to do with the fact that, now I might butcher this a little bit, but we have done MRI studies about beliefs and the human brain. And when we take benign beliefs like 2 + 2 = 4, or things that we aren't emotionally attached to in any way, they seem to be processed and come from different parts of the brain than beliefs that are more political in nature, right? Is it like a moral question? Is it wrong or right to do this? Or, you could ask like sports teams about their favorite sports. You could ask about political questions and candidates and policies. Anything that feels political and emotionally charged in nature seems to come from a different part of the brain, or at least processed very differently. And so it's like there is something that is making it difficult for doctors to think rationally and reasonably, right? They're engaging the wrong thinking system, because we have an emotional part of our brain that allows us to make snap judgments, to use heuristics, and to use feelings. And there are times when that is absolutely necessary. Then there is another part of our brain that was evolved to think more slowly and to, be able to piece together and to figure things out. And the quick, reactive, emotional part of our brain is very efficient. And the other part of our brain uses way more cognitive resources. It's cognitively expensive to think these things through. And so whenever we can, our brains opt to use the easy path, right? That's how we evolved. What we want to do is we want to minimize energy expenditure, and we want to maximize energy gain, gaining social status, getting food, survivability. And I feel like these parasitic ideologies, they really hijack parts of our brain and force us to use parts that we should not be using to make decisions that affect people's lives in such a dramatic way like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be said about the whole movement, right? And like everybody involved in it. Like, clearly rational thinking is not being preferred here, and including in like my case, and it sounds like your case, because of trauma and other factors. So following up with the question about children transitioning and like the effects that has, what do you think about when people say like, okay, kids shouldn't transition, but adults can do what they want, right? Like, you're over 18, or some people will even say like 25 or whatever. And I'd like to share it once you're finished. I'd like to share kind of my opinion on it as well. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you think about like this concept of just like, well, it's an adult's choice. They can do what they want.
Yeah. So just to make sure I understand the difference between, because like we just talked about childhood transition, and so what do I think about adult transition?
Yeah, and just the argument that because someone is legally an adult, they can do whatever they want when it comes to transition.
Yeah, so I feel like this one is definitely more nuanced, and it's not nearly as clear when it comes to children. And like I was saying earlier, that when I was 25, I opted for bottom surgery, and it still took me many years to really develop the kinds of, the perspective and the tools to make a better, more informed decision, where I came to realize that I was wrong. And so even as adults, we're not guaranteed to make good decisions. It really depends on, okay.
That's a different kitty, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's Mona. He right clicked and then selected an option, and I'm like, okay, we're not going to do this. Okay, yeah. When it comes to adults, I feel like let's kind of examine the extremes, and then we'll see where we can find in the middle here.
Mm-hmm.
We'll start with, should adults not be allowed to transition? So basically, should no one ever be allowed to transition? I don't find myself completely agreeing with this, because at some point, people have to have, I believe, autonomy over their own bodies. You can't 100% deny someone's agency. Because how could you really know that someone might not genuinely, like, let's say they have all the information and they still want to make it, an informed decision and consent to this procedure. How do you know 100% that they wouldn't actually just kind of be happier living and passing as the opposite sex? I don't think we could say that. And now let's examine the other side of the spectrum, where adults always have an idea, or like all adults should be able to, and there should be zero gatekeeping. Clearly, this doesn't make any sense, because you have people who are mentally ill, you have people that are confused, you have people that don't have the tools, you have people like the cognitive tools to understand, you have people that are motivated by trauma. Most people are motivated by things, and they have no idea where that motivation is actually coming from. Most people don't have the ability to even recognize what they're feeling in real time, let alone interpret it the right way. And you have people I've clearly seen, like, I work in Seattle. I see people so detached from reality that someone could just come up, smack them on the head, take all their stuff. Someone, you know what I mean? Like, people who are just induced in these drug comas. Like, there is no way that everybody knows what they're doing all the time. That's clearly not true. And so I think where the real answer lies here is way closer to the side of almost no one should transition, because I think that if you helped someone get mentally healthy, help them become emotionally mature, give them the tools to recognize how they're feeling, why they're feeling that way, and what to do with it, and truly follow a path of authenticity, to, like, basically, if you can give someone maximum agency, I think almost nobody would transition. But I still leave room for the possibility of a few exceptions.
Yeah. And I think a complicating factor is, like, people are learning about transition now and being born in the wrong body at a very impressionable age. I was 13 when I found online that, like, people who were born female were actually transitioning. Like, I didn't know that prior to that. And I started taking hormones when I was 23. For, like, I just did like one dose, and then I decided not to transition for a while. My main, like, transition was when I was 28, was like when I actually took hormones for a while and, like, sought out top surgery and things like that. But the problem is that, like, the foundations of me medically transitioning was laid down when I was at a very impressionable age. So it's like at age 13 is when I started framing my life as, like, oh, I'm actually born in the wrong body. And, like, if I don't transition, like, I didn't transition for a long time, but I had this underlying belief that, like, well, I can't really be happy unless I, live as my authentic self, which is a man. So I feel like it's so complicated, because, like, even if somebody is transitioning as an adult, it's like, if they're learning about these ideas much earlier and they're believing all of these falsehoods. Basically what I'm saying is, I guess I don't think anybody can ethically transition if they are basing their decision on a bunch of untruths. And it definitely shouldn't be like recommended, you know, by any medical provider, but somebody that does choose to do that, like I believe they deserve like medical support and psychological support and all of that. But yeah, that's kind of where I stand with it. It's like such a complex issue.
Yeah, it's definitely complex. And it doesn't help that there are all these ideas around it, all these there's like doesn't help that it's wrapped in an ideology. It doesn't help that you have larger parasitic ideas that are like weaponizing doctors' empathy against them to focus on short-term outcomes as opposed to long-term,
Yeah.
to destroy their critical thinking capacity. And even with just like take the ideology, or like take these contentious issues aside,
Mm-hmm.
and just think about like normal things that normal people go about their lives and they focus on. I think it's true that in light of reality, most people would make wildly different decisions about most things in general, right? And one way that I believe that this is true is look at near-death experiences. When people have near-death experiences, they're forced to take a radically different perspective of their life, what they've been doing, and to reevaluate what actually matters. And people tend to radically reorientate what they focus on, and then take that idea and zoom back into like this specific thing with gender, and like how could someone, really make an informed decision about this stuff in the current climate.
Yeah, absolutely. You've alluded to like your surgery that you had, your bottom surgery. Can you tell us like what that was like and how that has affected your life?
Yeah. So after I started transitioning with hormones, like I said, I was very much. I wanted to. I really wish I was just embodied as female, and so that I didn't really have the words for it at that time, and so I was convinced I was born in the wrong body, and so I was like I just I felt real dysmorphia, having male genitalia, looking living life through this particular lens. And so I was like, I'm getting bottom surgery. I knew, I was not under no illusion that this would change my sex, or that, I would have periods or have a uterus or have babies or anything. I knew it was just, I thought it was going to be aesthetic, and it was going to be at least functional for intercourse. And in San Francisco, while I was still in the transitional living program through the youth homeless shelter program, I had just got a job and I just saved a bunch of money, and I just worked for years and to save up enough money to get surgery. And it was in 2012 or 13. I flew to Thailand, and so I was so dead set on this that I was like, I'm going through with it. I'll go alone if I have to, and as long as I'm at least I'm going through with it, as long as I give it a shot, like even if I end up dying, this will be the right decision, because this is what I've always wanted. And so I flew to Thailand on my own, and I specifically wanted to go to Thailand because there's, at least at the time, two different kinds of surgery. One of them was just to, invert the penis. But that means that the skin for the penis is basically like you're taking outside skin and using that for the inside. But an actual vagina is like a mucous membrane, right? The same kind of tissue that's on the inside of your mouth. And I just wanted to be female so bad. I just wanted the thing that seemed like the most realistic. And so I opted for the other surgery, which was where they use part of your large intestine as the inside for the cavity. And the large intestine is a mucous membrane, because its function is to essentially secrete little mucus pustules to make waste move through you easier. And the colon itself doesn't produce food waste, although within the mucous pustules, it does release some dead like blood cells, I believe. And so normally the mucus that it produces is mostly just clear, or I think it's entirely clear unless there's a buildup. And so I flew to Thailand, paid them, at the time it was just like $12,000. And they had everything set up. They picked me up at the airport. Within 2 days, I was on the operating table. You know, they cut me open, they took it out, and they did the surgery. And so they're basically cutting into a different, healthy, functioning system to help you create this other system. And so it's incredibly invasive, way more possibility for complication, you know, and they didn't really make it clear exactly what could happen. You know, they let me know that there's more of a possibility of necrosis, but no attempt to really help me understand what that actually meant. Mm. I recovered in a hospital bed for 5 days. It went well. And then I spent 3 weeks in a hotel by myself before finally flying back to the States.
Wow.
There's been no major complications since. I am incredibly lucky.
Yeah.
And I followed the dilation procedure at least for a little while. But, you know, when you have all these comorbidities of like anxiety and depression, you begin to, you know, and they don't go away afterwards, right? Because the chain of causality isn't gender dysphoria causes everything else. You know, essentially, when all those things came back, like how do you expect me to take care of myself? Like I didn't remain motivated to dilate and to keep that practice up. And on the inside of the canal that they make, you get about 2 or 3 inches of depth before you hit this muscle. And so they had to cut through the muscle, right? And the muscle is basically just like a whole bunch of fibers that are connected. So they cut along a fiber to make like a hole, and they lay part of the intestine through that hole to give you another like 2 to 3 inches of depth. And so when you're dilating, not only are you dilating the hard seam between outside skin abruptly connected to mucous membrane, which doesn't stretch very well. They have two entirely different properties, right? Because form follows function. Mm-hmm. And so there's bleeding with that seam. Not only are you dilating that seam, but you're dilating that muscle to keep it open because it wants to close. Just like, you can see I have gauged ears. Let me see.
Yeah.
Here. And so I used to have 3/4 inch gauged ears, and your skin wants to just shrink back up. And so there's enough of a hole there where I can put like, you know, maybe not even this pin would fit through that hole now, but if it's a little bit thinner, I could just kind of put the pen through. So your tissue wants to close up.
Right.
But that's what that muscle does. So if you don't dilate it, it'll just close. And then the seams along those fibers will heal. And now the only way you can get it to a point where it would be wide enough to even try to have penetrative sex again, I would essentially have to do painful daily dilations of slowly stretching and tearing that muscle open again. And so I just haven't.
Sounds incredibly painful and just, you know, time consuming. Like, you know, any like daily routine that you're not used to, like it takes effort to establish that routine. And that's, if, you know, when it's something that's like very painful and like invasive, like, I mean, that just sounds extremely difficult.
Yeah. It's entirely unnecessary. Not even just the whole surgery, but the particular one that I opted for. You know.
Yeah.
It doesn't help.
I'm so sorry to hear that. And I mean, I'm glad that you're lucky in that you didn't have like these serious complications that we hear about from people having like that procedure in particular, or having to have, you know, dozens of revision surgeries and all of that. Have you had to have any revision surgeries?
No. And thank goodness I haven't, because I've heard horrible
Yeah.
stories. Like, if I was actually to lay this out, like, what rating would I give this surgery? I'd give it a 3 out of 10. And I give it a 3 because a 2 would be like, I still have feeling in what became the head of the basically just tissue from the end of the penis, and they were able to preserve the nerves and the endings, so I can actually have feeling, and so I can actually still orgasm and play myself at least, right? And so if I've heard of people who no longer have feeling there, imagine not being able to. Some people have to deal with
Yeah.
that. I would give that a 2. And a 1 would just be necrosis and needing massive amounts of reconstructive surgery. And I've seen images of people who basically the tissue around it just dies. And now you have an open wound, and scar tissue is going to grow because the tissue that would normally cover up the wound is now just dead. And
Yeah.
even without those things, I only give it a 3. Don't do
Well,
it.
and it would be one thing, yeah, it would be one thing if like this was a like actually a life-saving surgery. Like if you did not have the surgery, your
Right.
own body would kill you. Because I mean, usually cases of really invasive surgery, like to remove cancer or something like that, is like the patient's life is
Yeah.
genuinely
They're weighing harm
in
versus
danger.
more harm.
Yeah, versus this, I mean, there's the argument that people will commit suicide if they don't get the surgeries. But you know, there's also research that shows suicidality is not improved after the surgery. It's just as high after the surgery, essentially.
Yeah. I hear
And
it can
then
even be worse.
I mean, it would make sense, you know, if it would even go up, because if you are already struggling with, you know, mental health problems or trauma or whatever you're struggling with going in, it's like then when you have, I mean, it's almost disabling, right? Like it's like if you have like a healthy functional body part, and then you know, people have various levels of complications, but even, you know, like to me, being required to have to find the time to like dilate every day, or like
Yeah.
it's going to close up, like that seems very disruptive to your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's very disruptive. It's debilitating. I mean, I can no longer reproduce, right? I can't, I no longer have a penis, so I can't like make love the way my body was intended to. That affects sexual pleasure. That affects connections with romantic partners. Like imagine, like I'm lucky in that I've had a partner stick with me through a lot of this for 11 years now. And we met actually just a few weeks before I had flown off to Thailand.
Oh wow.
And I'm lucky that she still loves me and wants to be with me. But there are many other detransitioners who now find themselves detransitioned, post-operative, and are like, how the hell do I date now?
Yeah.
Like, if you're male and a detransitioner post-op, whether you like men or women, right? Like, how do you find someone? I mean,
Yeah.
you have to be someone who, for the most part, cares about, who is okay with the fact that you don't have a reproductive organ, and you probably have to find someone who's also like bi or something. You know what I mean? It's like your potential dating pool has now shrunk significantly, and that's going to
Yeah.
affect moving forward and just being healthy and trying to live a fulfilled life.
And that could be another factor in like suicide post surgery. Circling back to the part about like, you know, this level of invasive surgery is usually only performed in, you know, dire circumstances. Do you think that like the doctors who perform your surgery, or just, you know, gender clinics and doctors and others who are kind of pushing this and like enabling people to get these procedures. Do you think that those institutions should be held legally responsible?
Yeah. So we'll start off with the most important aspect, which is with great power comes great responsibility, right? This is the very reason that the medical establishment has the Hippocratic Oath, because throughout history, we have seen the massive amount of harm done to people because we thought we knew what we were doing when we had absolutely no idea, right? This ultimately comes down to one of the most important questions that I like to ask people, which is, what does it feel like to be wrong? And oftentimes people answer, it feels bad to be wrong, or it hurts. But that's actually answering a different question. That's answering, what does it feel like to discover that you're wrong? But what does it actually feel like to actively be wrong? And what it feels like is just like being right. And that's profound because many times throughout human history, people thought they knew the truth and they knew what was right, and they were wrong.
Right.
And especially in the medical industry, because you are intervening in incredibly complex biological systems that often have downstream consequences of things that we don't even understand. And so this comes with great responsibility, right? It's not about the short-term outcome, although in rare cases, maybe it can be. Ultimately, it's about the long-term health benefits and well-being of the patients. And given how wrong and how easy it is for people to be wrong, we have to take extraordinary measure to make sure what we are diagnosing, the treatments we give, truly comport with reality. And when we don't, harm happens. Look back at the way we did lobotomies. You know, people, even before that, people used to be strapped to tables, organs removed. There are all kinds of examples throughout history where people were just unnecessarily went through a kind of torture. And we have the tools of science, right? We have to use them. We cannot let our empathy become weaponized against us to make it feel like we're doing right when we're actually doing wrong. And so people absolutely have to be held accountable.
Wow, that was that quote about empathy was very profound. I like that a lot. And yes, I mean, we at Transition Justice 100% agree. I've heard it both ways that, and you know, I think it's somewhere in the middle. I think a lot of the doctors, like on one end, like I think people that are performing like gender affirming surgeries on kids, like maybe like it's possible they believe they're doing the right thing, you know, but like some of them I don't see how you could do that to somebody and still I don't know. Like I think that there is, you know, they're thinking about money or just have some sort of ulterior motive. And then there's people like, you know, like my doctor who just referred me to another clinic that knew more about gender. He's like, oh, we don't really deal with like we don't have experience with helping patients with gender dysphoria, and they referred me somewhere else. And you know, in that case, I think that they believe they were doing the right thing, you know, by referring me somewhere else where I ended up getting affirmed. And so yeah, but I think either way, like, you know, we should be able to trust our institutions, but I think everyone needs to be doing their due diligence when it comes to this issue, because it does have a lot of potential to cause harm, and especially with how much it's exploding and how many more people are going down this path now. Doctors and mental health providers and all of that need to have an awareness of all of the potential harms.
Yeah. I mean, doctors even unrelated to gender medicine, like you were just saying, where a doctor refers to another organization, right? And that's because the corpus of human knowledge is so massive that we've had to rely on essentially a kind of a vetting process where we build knowledge on top of other knowledge. And, there's a kind of trust that's at play. And doctors should always, embrace a sense of epistemic humility and be willing to admit what they don't know. And that seems exactly like what you were talking about, deferring to a different organization. But we've gotten to a point where some of our institutions have become so ideologically captured, right? Especially when it comes to gender medicine. You essentially have a citation cartel where you have a whole bunch of studies and arguments referencing other studies and arguments that turns into this big circular, like, right? You have A to B and then B back to A, which is the simplest example of circular reasoning. Now expand that to the whole alphabet, and then you begin to build a raft that's so big it becomes like a cruise ship where it's so stable it doesn't feel like you're on the water, but you're still on the water and not on the ground. And so now it's become to the point, I mean, you even see in like the social science and the replication crisis that we have, right? It's become to the point where now just embracing a sense of epistemic humility, it's not good enough, because your own network of references and you essentially cannot easily trust the people you are deferring to anymore. And so now doctors have to take an additional step of responsibility on top of their already heavy workload to learn about something they're not specializing in, to now protect their patients.
Yeah. When you said like deferring to someone else, I just thought of how, if you look up the American Academy of Pediatrics statement about, youth transitions, like they defer to WPATH. And then when you look at WPATH, they're like, oh, well, the AAP like endorses this. So you actively see that happening with these medical organizations. And yeah, I mean, it's like doctors have to have such a huge knowledge base, and like there are so many opportunities to get it wrong. But yeah, I definitely feel like the WPATH is essentially like an activist organization, and I feel like their push for a certain type of research, for doctors to have particular opinions, like I also feel like there's been an inorganic push for like certain outcomes in the medical industry. So you got your surgery, and you were still on hormones at that point too, as well.
Yeah. I actually taken I got surgery at like 2013 or 12ish. I was 25. I continued taking cross-sex hormones almost up until about a year and a half ago.
Okay,
And,
so yeah, that's a really long time to be on hormones. What was kind of your aha moment, or if you had one? Was it more of like a gradual process of deciding to detransition, or was there something that like really spoke to you and you decided, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to, go back to living as my birth sex?
Yeah, so it was a bit of potential energy buildup and then an aha moment. And so about a year and a half after surgery, I realized that I no longer cared about living and passing as female, as strange as it sounds. I always kind of sought comfort in an androgynous look. And so I kind of just went back to my comfort zone, which is to look androgynous, to kind of look ambiguous. Like, is that a guy? Is it potentially like an androgynous lesbian? Like, kind of just like ambiguity is where I had some comfort. And so I kind of went back to that style. But I didn't quite let go of the female pronouns, although I definitely stopped caring what people clocked me as, whether someone said he or she. I just didn't care anymore. I just kind of let a lot of that go. And so I just continued to be androgynous for many, many years. And maybe at the beginning of 2022, maybe just at the end of 2021, a lot of gender ideology had kind of snuck up on me, because I still, like, when I said transgender, I still thought I was on the same page with what other people thought. I didn't know that they really just meant gender nonconforming, and that this whole new umbrella opened up.
Mm.
And so I started to identify as non-binary, because from my perspective, they were just entirely different categories. I was trans because I had transitioned, and you can't undo transition. And I was still taking estrogen, and I identified as non-binary because I'm like, that was my way of saying I don't. It's not like I'm necessarily saying I'm not a man or a woman. I'm just gender nonconforming, and so I don't really fit into these roles, because I still viewed masculine and feminine as two, like, rigid categories. And then, so I had let a lot of this go. I had let a lot of trying to be female go, but I still hadn't realized that there was still an other half of the coin that I had not addressed, which was rejection of masculinity because of my father and the way he treated me,
Mm-hmm.
and the way I had dealt with that. And so, essentially, in early 2023, I had started to read books about the human brain, the human mind, and how beliefs form, and how minds change. I read David McRaney's How Minds Change. It's an amazing book. I then read a book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. And that book helped me understand that I had absolutely no idea. I had no frame of reference for what healthy, mature, emotionally mature relationships looked like. It helped me understand that the relationships I thought were fine weren't, because we weren't emotionally intimate. I had really just kept to myself. I didn't share deep, dark things. I didn't feel like I had someone to truly confide in. I thought being chronically lonely was normal, right? I kept telling myself my whole life, I'm normal, and that's how I coped, right? And this really kept a lot of these problems hidden from me. And this book provided the perspective to see what healthy relationships looked like and what unhealthy relationships looked like. That allowed me to understand my current friendships, what was working and what wasn't, what I was lacking and what wasn't, and how lonely and unconnected I was. And then I turned those tools onto my past and my mom and my relationship with her. That naturally led me to my father, which at that point, right, I'm just like, I'm over my dad. He doesn't control me. I'm over all of that, without recognizing that set the trajectory, that so many of the tools I had developed to deal with him were so just ingrained in my natural way of functioning. I didn't even recognize that that's what had happened, right? That book gave me the tools to look back at my father. And that's when I replayed those stories that I told towards the beginning of this conversation. What my dad did to me, and how I coped, how I internalized and froze, how I told myself I wish I was a girl. And I had this moment, this holy shit. That's not when I knew. That's what caused my gender dysphoria. And I had built my entire life around the rejection of my father. I had inverted the way that he saw masculinity, and built myself on the inverse of that. And and that's when I knew that this whole time I thought I had agency, it was all just reactivity.
Yeah, that's a huge realization.
And over the next 2 weeks, especially the week immediately following that realization, it was like the craziest emotional roller coaster I had ever been on, because we don't actually choose our beliefs. We're either convinced of something or we're not. And in light of new evidence, those beliefs will change.
Yeah.
Right. And a clear example of this is like stage magic. Funny enough, you watch stage magic, And as soon as they do the reveal, you thought it was somewhere and now it's there. And you have that moment.
Yeah.
And that's you recognizing in real time that your beliefs have updated without you even recognizing it. Right? And it was just a week of cascading realizations and moments. And at the time, the way that I was processing a lot of negative emotions, because I was in a very emotionally hostile environment, where I just could not be authentic and express myself. And so I would go for walks, and I was smoking a lot of weed at the time, which helped me explore ideas in a psychologically safe way. But of course, the weed became an immediate ball and chain, and because it was just a dependency. And so I just went on walks, and I was just like walking with my sunglasses with like just tears streaming down my face, like every day with this cascading series of beliefs coming down. And I had essentially just had to rebuild myself from the ground up. And that was a hell of a time.
I bet. I mean, that takes a lot of strength to do that. Like after what you've been through and believing you were one way for so many years and having, this really foundational framework, and then just kind of having that pulled out from under you or, shattered. I mean, yeah, I really admire you for your strength and, getting through that and like being here to speak with me today, and also being willing to share your story so that other people can see themselves in your story. I think that you're going to be like a really valuable voice to this movement.
Thank you so much. That encouragement means a lot to me.
I want to open it up to you and just say, is there anything else that you feel that you haven't shared that you would like to share, or anything that you want our audience to take away from this?
Yeah. So one of the main things I'd like the audience to take away is, I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. And that's feeling wrong feels exactly like being right.
Mm-hmm.
Being right, it's a feeling that arises, right? It's like a heuristic of confidence. And we always need to be willing to re-examine our beliefs. And right, that is basically at the core of science itself. The reason the scientific method works so well is because you take an idea, you put it in reality, and you do everything you can to try to knock it down. And if it still stands, then there's some validity that it can be used to model for predictive power. Then that you're onto something. And if you are protecting your ideas, you need to examine why. Because almost certainly you don't actually know the reason why. And you have to be willing to, instead of trying to brute force to keep a sense of security, be willing to let these things go and to be still and to recognize when these feelings arise and to treat them with curiosity and to pull on them like a thread. And you don't have to rush. You just take your time and just keep pulling. And you have the things that can unravel will change your life. And so I think that's a big one. Another thing that I want to share is gratitude. Gratitude is probably the single most important emotion that you can gain control over. Like I said, fight or flight and reactivity are essentially mutually exclusive with gratitude. And if you find that reactivity and fight or flight and in a constant state of fear is running your life, you almost certainly don't have anywhere near the amount of agency you think you do. And the best way to grasp agency is through gratitude. And one of the best ways to achieve gratitude is perspective. It's to put yourself in perspective in a larger context. To recognize how lucky you are almost in any certain circumstance. Like the truth is, there is always someone who has suffered more than you have unnecessarily. There is someone who has had a worse life than you, And so I think about things like I wasn't born hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. I wasn't enslaved, beaten. I didn't see my family murdered or raped in front of me. You know, there are countless examples of things that people have gone through that I can look at and be like, I am so glad. I am so lucky to be here. After everything I've been through, to be right here, right now, knowing what I know, sometimes I feel like one of the luckiest people in the world, because now I can make a difference. Now I can take all of this suffering and I can put it towards something productive.
Yeah.
Gratitude is always within reach. You just have to figure out how to get there. Perspective is one of the best tools you'll have to get there.
Yeah, amen to that. And something I really picked up on while you were talking about the gratitude as well is that really ties into empathy also, you know, like thinking about other people in the world or people that lived before us and, you know, the impacts of like what they went through. I feel like empathy and gratitude go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Airiel. It's been a pleasure talking with you as always. I'd love to have you back sometime.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, of course. And for anyone watching this, if you haven't seen the Partners for Ethical Care panel from Santa Fe yet, that is out now. There are 6 detransitioners who are sharing their experiences and their stories. So you'll see Airiel and 5 other detransitioners as well.
Excellent.
All right.
Yeah. Can I tell people where to follow me?
Oh, yes, please do.
Yeah, you can follow me on X at sackless_Jack.
Awesome. Oh my gosh.
So yeah, Jack was my birth name. So I'm reclaiming this idea of, you know, a dead name. Like you don't need to change identity to try to run away or escape, you know, like every name that every name that I've had and identity I've had, it's still me, you know, and I want people to embrace resilience. So my X name essentially reflects that.
Thank you everybody for tuning in. Please follow Airiel and check out that panel as well. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks for watching.